The evening air had a chill to it, the kind that hinted at a coming storm, but for now, it was just cold enough to make the world feel quieter than usual. The neon lights of Tony's pizzeria flickered, casting a soft glow on the empty street outside. Inside, the warm scent of melted cheese and freshly baked dough filled the air. The kitchen was quiet, save for the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional clink of dishes. It was a slow night, one of those evenings when the world outside seemed to have forgotten about pizza, said Brian. The president's natural counsel had simplified matters down to the core menu and was not going to look up. Carlos leaned against the counter, wiping down the surfaces, his eyes drifting to the clock. It was nearing midnight. He was about to close up for the night, having long since finished the last of the orders. A sense of peace had settled over the pizzeria, the kind of quiet that only comes when you know the day is almost over. But then the bell above the door jingled softly, pulling Carlos from his thoughts. He looked up to see a man standing at the entrance, his figure silhouetted against the dim light outside. Carlos couldn't make out any details, just a shadow of a person, tall, dressed in a long coat, his face obscured by the brim of a hat. He wasn't sure how he hadn't noticed the man approaching. It was almost as if he had appeared out of nowhere. Carlos called out, his voice breaking the stillness of the pizzeria. The man didn't respond right away. Instead, he stepped into the restaurant, the sound of his footsteps muffled by the thick carpet near the door. Carlos instinctively glanced at the clock again, but the time seemed to blur in his vision for a moment. Something about the man's presence made the room feel heavier, unsettling. The stranger finally spoke, his voice low and calm. "I'd like to place an order." Carlos hesitated, a strange feeling creeping up his spine. It wasn't the first time someone had come in late for food, but there was something different about this customer. "We're about to close," Carlos said, trying to sound polite but firm. "I can take an order, but it's going to be a few minutes." The man nodded slowly, but there was no indication that he planned to leave any time soon. Instead, he walked toward the counter, his footsteps soundless, almost ghostly. As he drew closer, Carlos couldn't help but notice how perfectly still the man seemed, like he was made of the same shadows that filled the corners of the pizzeria. "What can I get you?" Carlos asked, forcing himself to focus on the task at hand. His fingers fumbled with the order pad, his mind still trying to shake the unease that had settled in his chest. The man paused for a moment, his gaze flickering to the menu on the wall. "I'll have a large pepperoni pizza," he said, his tone smooth and deliberate. "Extra cheese, no sauce." Carlos blinked. "No sauce?" He had to make sure he had heard right. "Are you sure about that?" The man didn't respond. Instead, he just stared at Carlos, his face hidden beneath the shadow of his hat. The air seemed to grow colder, the hairs on the back of Carlos's neck standing up. It was as if the room itself had grown darker. No sauce," the man repeated, his voice barely more than a whisper. "And a bottle of your finest soda." Carlos felt a chill in the pit of his stomach. Something was off. "All right," he said slowly, writing down the order. He was trying to shake the strange feeling, trying to convince himself it was just a late-night weirdness. But as he turned to start preparing the order, he couldn't shake the feeling that the man was watching him. Really watching him, like he was waiting for something. "Meh." The bell above the door jingled again, and Carlos glanced back. The man had turned toward the window, his back to the counter now. The pizzeria was silent again, except for the quiet hum of the refrigerator. Carlos tried to ignore the gnawing unease growing in his chest as he began preparing the pizza. He worked quickly, trying to finish the order and close up, but when he reached for the sauce, the memory of the man's strange request stopped him. No sauce. Why would anyone order a pizza like that? His mind raced as he stretched the dough, added the cheese, and arranged the pepperoni. The quiet of the pizzeria seemed to stretch on longer than it should have, the minutes slipping by in a haze. Carlos could barely focus, his thoughts drifting back to the man who stood by the window, still staring outside into the darkness. The pizza was nearly ready when Carlos noticed something that made his heart skip a beat. The man had never paid. Carlos turned toward the counter, but the man was gone. The door had closed behind him with no sound, and in his place, only a lingering coldness remained. Carlos stood frozen in place, his hand still gripping the pizza cutter. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened. He had been certain the man was standing right there, his tall shadowed figure at the counter, asking for the strange pizza order. But now, there was nothing, just the cold silence of the empty pizzeria. He glanced toward the door, half expecting to see the man lingering outside, but the street was empty. The street lights cast long shadows on the pavement, and the usual hum of traffic was missing. It was as if the entire world had gone still. Carlos blinked, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling creeping up his spine. Maybe the man had slipped out while he was distracted. It wouldn't have been the first time someone had snuck out without paying, though something about this felt different. Silence reigned in the room. He set the pizza cutter down and walked cautiously to the door, peering out into the night. The chill in the air seemed sharper now, biting at his skin, but there was no sign of the man, no trace of anyone having been there at all. The street was as empty as it had been when Carlos first glanced outside. Sighing, he closed the door and locked it, trying to convince himself that it was just his imagination playing tricks on him. After all, it was late, and he had been working for hours. Fatigue had a way of making everything feel strange, right? He turned back to the counter, ready to finish the pizza and get out of there. But then he noticed something that made his stomach drop. The pizza box, the one he had been preparing for the customer. It was still sitting there on the counter, untouched. No, Carlos had set it aside when he went to check the door. But now he saw that it was open. He hadn't opened it. And there, in the middle of the box, was the pizza, just as he had made it. A large pepperoni pizza with extra cheese. No sauce. Nathaniel? He frowned, confusion flooding his mind. Had the man taken it after all? But no, he would have heard the door jingle again, or at least seen him leave. He hadn't. The pizza was exactly as the man had ordered, but now it felt wrong. The cheese was strangely too thick, the pepperoni unevenly scattered across the top. Carlos had made plenty of pizzas before, but this one felt off. It was like the ingredients were all there, but something about the way they had come together didn't sit right. He reached for the pizza box to close it, but before his fingers could touch it, a sharp sound echoed through the restaurant, a faint, scratching noise coming from the back of the kitchen. Carlos froze. The kitchen was empty, the ovens turned off, the counters cleared. He had just checked everything when he made the pizza. The sound, though quiet, was unmistakable. A scratching, like something was trying to claw its way through the walls. His heart skipped a beat. The hairs on his neck stood up, and for a moment he felt as though the walls of the pizzeria were closing in on him. He stood motionless, staring toward the back of the kitchen, listening. The scratching continued for a few seconds, then abruptly stopped. Carlos swallowed hard. The room felt colder now, the air thick with a sense of dread. His breath was shallow, his pulse quickening. He tried to shake it off, but the feeling of being watched, of something lurking just out of sight, was too strong. He took a hesitant step toward the kitchen, his footsteps sounding far too loud in the quiet. The lights above flickered, casting brief shadows on the walls, and Carlos felt a chill run down his spine. His mind raced with possibilities. Rats. Maybe a loose pipe scraping against the wall. He tried to convince himself it was nothing, but the fear gnawed at him. He reached the kitchen doorway, his eyes scanning the dimly lit space. There was nothing there, nothing out of place. The only sound was the faint hum of the refrigerator. Carlos stepped into the kitchen, his footsteps cautious, his senses heightened. As he walked further in, he glanced toward the back wall where the scratching had come from. There, just beyond the corner, he saw something that made his blood run cold. Oh! The wall was cracked. A thin line ran across the surface as if something had scraped against it. It was barely noticeable, but in the dim light it stood out like a scar on the pizzeria's otherwise pristine kitchen. He leaned closer, inspecting the crack. It was new, he was sure of it. It hadn't been there earlier when he had cleaned the kitchen. And then, just as he was about to turn away, a cold breeze swept through the room, carrying with it a faint scent. Something rotten, something like decay. Carlos's breath caught in his throat. The smell was overwhelming now, thick and heavy, clinging to the air around him. It wasn't the usual smell of old food or grease. It was something far worse, something that made his stomach churn. His eyes darted around the room, looking for the source of the smell, but before he could make sense of anything, a shadow flickered in the corner of his vision. He spun around, his heart racing. The kitchen was empty, but something told him he wasn't alone. Carlos's breath caught in his throat, and for a moment the world seemed to hold its breath along with him. The kitchen was silent once more, but the sensation of being watched lingered like a heavy fog. His eyes darted around, scanning every corner, every shadow, searching for something, anything that could explain what was happening. But there was nothing. Just the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the eerie stillness of the room. His heart thudded painfully in his chest as he took a hesitant step back. His hand instinctively reached for the light switch by the door, flicking it on. The fluorescent lights buzzed to life, casting a harsh, sterile glow over the room. Nothing looked out of place, no movement, no strange figures lurking in the corners. Yet the unease in his gut only grew stronger. Carlos took a deep breath, trying to calm himself. It was just his mind playing tricks on him. It had to be. The late hours, the exhaustion, the isolation, all of it could be messing with his head. He turned to leave the kitchen, but as his foot touched the floor, something stopped him. A faint noise, barely audible, but distinct. A whisper. He froze. It wasn't the refrigerator's hum or the air conditioning. It was something else, something that didn't belong. It was a low murmur, almost like someone was speaking just out of earshot. Carlos strained his ears, trying to make out the words, but it was no use. The whispering was distant, as though it was coming from somewhere deep within the walls. A shiver ran down his spine, and he felt the hairs on the back of his neck rise. His instincts screamed at him to leave, to run, but his feet felt rooted to the spot. He was frozen, unable to move, his mind swirling with questions and fear. The whispering grew louder, more distinct, but still he couldn't make out the words. It sounded almost like a chant, an unintelligible string of syllables, as if the very walls were speaking to him. Suddenly the sound stopped, the silence returned, more oppressive than ever. Carlos blinked, his heart hammering in his chest. He didn't know what was worse, the whispering or the silence that followed. Both felt unnatural, like something was crawling under his skin, scratching at his nerves. Carlos managed a muffled smile before continuing to talk. His mind raced as he turned toward the door, his legs shaking with every step. He had to get out of there. He had to leave before whatever was in that kitchen, whatever was whispering to him, found him. He reached the doorway, but before he could step through, his eyes fell upon the pizza box again, still sitting on the counter, its contents unchanged. He hesitated. The unease in his gut was unbearable, but something about the pizza, something about the way it had been left there, untouched, pulled at him. It was as though the pizza was waiting for him to do something, as though it held the answers he was desperately searching for. Still, he tried his best to remain still. Carlos took a slow step toward the counter, his hand trembling as he reached for the box. He could feel his heart racing in his chest, each beat louder than the last. He was terrified, but something inside him urged him to keep going, to find out what was really going on. He lifted the lid of the box, and as he did, the air seemed to grow colder. The temperature in the room dropped, and a chill ran down his spine. But it wasn't just the cold. It was the sensation of something else, something wrong. The pizza looked exactly as it had before, but now, as Carlos stared at it, he noticed something new. The pepperoni. It wasn't just unevenly placed. It was as if the slices had been arranged deliberately, forming a pattern that seemed almost familiar. His breath hitched as he leaned closer, his eyes scanning the pizza. The pepperoni was arranged in the shape of a strange symbol. It was subtle, barely noticeable, but there it was, a jagged, irregular shape that looked like some sort of ancient rune. Carlos's stomach turned, a wave of nausea sweeping over him. He couldn't tear his eyes away from the pizza. The symbol seemed to pulse, as though it was alive, as though it was watching him, waiting for him to understand. He stepped back, his heart racing. His mind screamed for him to stop, to walk away, but something held him there. The symbol on the pizza seemed to draw him in, its presence overwhelming, suffocating. Burrito stepped into the pizza pit. His presence provided backdrop to the music all around him, and in slow motion, make it, make it, make it, make it, make it, make it, make it. And then, just as he was about to close the box and walk away, the lights above flickered again. The room plunged into darkness for a brief moment, and when the lights came back on, Carlos gasped. The pizza was gone. The box was empty. His hand shot to his mouth as his eyes frantically scanned the room. There was no trace of the pizza, no sign of the strange symbol that had once been there. It was as if it had never existed. But he knew it had. He had seen it. The symbol, the pizza, the way it had felt wrong, it was all real. Carlos's pulse quickened, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He had to leave. He had to get out of there. The fear that had been simmering in his chest was now a full-blown panic, and his legs trembled as he turned to flee. But as he reached for the door, a voice, soft, barely a whisper, came from behind him. Carlos. He froze, his body stiffening with terror. He didn't dare turn around. The voice was unmistakable. It was the same voice he had heard whispering from the walls. Carlos. It was closer now, and this time, it wasn't just a whisper, it was a command. Come back. Carlos's heart skipped a beat as the voice called his name again. It was no longer a whisper, but a low, commanding tone that seemed to come from all around him. The walls, the air, the very floor beneath his feet. He wanted to run, to escape, but his body refused to move. He stood frozen, his back to the door, his hand still gripping the handle as if it were the only thing keeping him grounded in the present. Carlos. The voice came again, softer now, almost coaxing. Come back. He couldn't breathe. His mind raced with 1,000 thoughts, each one more frantic than the last. The pizza box, the symbol, the whispering, none of it made sense. It was all too much, too unreal. But despite the overwhelming terror, something inside him, a force he couldn't explain, compelled him to turn around. Slowly, almost reluctantly, he let go of the door handle and pivoted to face the kitchen. Ready? Was the slow declare. The room was empty. The lights buzzed softly above him, casting long shadows across the tiles. The kitchen was just as it had been when he entered, save for one thing. The pizza box. Elizabeth. Carlos's breath hitched as he saw the box sitting on the counter, the lid slightly ajar, as if it had been waiting for him. He could feel the weight of it in his chest, a strange, magnetic pull urging him closer. It was impossible. He had seen it disappear. He had seen it vanish before his eyes. But here it was, as if nothing had happened, as if the last few minutes, the strange whispering, the symbol, none of it had ever occurred. His legs moved of their own accord, carrying him toward the counter. His fingers brushed against the edge of the box, and he hesitated for a moment. Should he open it again? Should he dare to see what was inside? But the pull was undeniable. The box beckoned him, and against his better judgment, he lifted the lid. The pizza was there, but it wasn't the same as before. The pepperoni was arranged differently now, the slices forming a new pattern, one that was even more intricate, more disturbing than the last. It was no longer a simple symbol. This time, the arrangement looked like a face, a grotesque, distorted face, staring back at him from the pizza. Carlos's breath caught in his throat as he stared at the face, his pulse racing. The eyes, two hollow circles of black, seemed to follow him as he moved, as though the face was alive, aware of his every motion. It was the face who made the final transformation from rag to depression. Carlos, the voice came again, closer this time, right behind him. He spun around, his heart slamming against his ribs, but there was no one there. The kitchen was still empty. "Hmm?" The voice echoed again, clearer now, but it wasn't just in his ears. It was inside his head, reverberating through his thoughts, drowning out everything else. "Come closer." Carlos's legs shook, but he couldn't stop himself. His feet carried him toward the counter, toward the pizza, toward the face. His hand reached out, trembling, and for a brief moment, he wondered if he was dreaming. If this was some twisted nightmare he couldn't wake up from. But the face on the pizza was real. The cold, lifeless eyes seemed to burn into him, pulling him in. The urge to touch it was overpowering, a strange compulsion that he couldn't explain. He reached out, his fingers grazing the surface of the pizza. The moment his skin made contact, the lights flickered again. The room seemed to shift, to warp around him. The walls stretched and contracted like they were breathing, and the temperature dropped to a bone-chilling cold. "Excuse me," whispered a whisper. "I did not start this fire." Carlos gasped, yanking his hand back as if the pizza had burned him, but the sensation didn't fade. His skin still tingled with the strange, cold energy that had surged through him when he touched the pizza. "Well, are you afraid?" the voice asked, its tone almost playful now. "You wanted to know. Now you do." Carlos stumbled back, his mind reeling. The voice. The pizza. It was all too much. It was impossible. He looked around the kitchen, his eyes wild, searching for an escape, but the room seemed to close in on him. The shadows in the corners were darker now, almost alive, and the air was thick with an unnatural stillness. He had to get out. He had to leave before whatever was happening to him consumed him completely. But as he reached for the door again, the voice whispered one last time, "Stay with me, Carlos." The words sank deep into his mind, and for a brief moment he considered them. He considered staying to uncover the truth, to understand what was happening. But then, a new thought crossed his mind, one that filled him with a cold, dreadful realization. It's the voice, the pizza, the strange symbol. They weren't just trying to pull him in. They were trying to claim him. The possibilities were endless, exciting. His pulse raced, and with a final burst of adrenaline, he threw open the door and bolted out of the kitchen. He didn't look back. He couldn't. But as he ran down the hallway, a chilling thought echoed in his mind. He wasn't alone anymore. Carlos didn't stop running. He barely registered the sound of his footsteps pounding against the floor as he rushed through the narrow hallways of the apartment complex. His heart was hammering in his chest, each beat a reminder of the fear gnawing at him, urging him to move faster, to escape whatever nightmare had been unleashed upon him. The voice, the pizza, the face. It was all too much, too surreal. His mind couldn't process it. His body moved on instinct, seeking refuge in the only place he knew, the front door. He had to get outside. He had to get away. But when he reached the door, his hands shaking as he grabbed the knob, something stopped him. It wasn't the door itself. No, it was the reflection. Carlos froze. His eyes flicked to the mirror hanging on the wall beside the door. For a split second, he thought he saw something, someone, standing behind him. He whipped around, but the hallway was empty. No one there. Just the dim light casting long shadows on the walls. His breath caught in his throat as he turned back to the mirror. There it was again. A figure. Pale, shadowy, almost indistinct. But its eyes, those eyes were unmistakable. Hollow, dark, watching him. At some point, those transitions had begun. Carlos's hand hovered over the door handle, the cold metal sending a shiver up his spine. He couldn't look away from the reflection. The figure in the mirror was moving, inching closer to him with every passing second, its form growing more defined. It was like the reflection wasn't his own, but someone else's, someone who shouldn't be there. He reached for his phone, his fingers trembling as he tried to unlock it, but his gaze remained fixed on the mirror. The figure in the reflection was now right behind him, its mouth slightly open, as if it were about to speak.
"Eh."
And then it did. "Carlos," the voice whispered, but it wasn't the same as before. This time, it was deeper, more menacing. "You can't escape me." His stomach churned, the fear threatening to choke him. He swung around, desperate to confront whatever was behind him, but once again, the hallway was empty. The silence pressed in on him like a heavy weight. The reflection, however, was not empty. The figure remained there, its eyes fixed on him with an intensity that made Carlos's skin crawl. The figure didn't belong in the mirror. It didn't belong in this world, but there it was. A twisted, distorted version of reality. Carlos stumbled back, his heart pounding in his chest as the reflection seemed to reach out for him, its hands pressing against the glass. It was as if the figure was trying to pull itself through the mirror, to step into his world. He spun around, his breath ragged, and with one last desperate move, he yanked open the door and stepped outside into the cool night air. For a moment, he thought he had escaped. He thought the nightmare was over. But when he looked around, he realized that nothing had changed. The street was empty, silent, dark. It was the same street he had been on before, the same one he had walked down countless times. But now, it felt different. The shadows seemed deeper, more oppressive. The air was thick with something that wasn't quite right. And then, he saw it. A figure standing across the street, just out of the reach of the streetlight. It was hard to make out, but Carlos could feel its presence. He could feel it watching him. He squinted, trying to focus. And then it happened. The figure stepped forward into the light, and for the briefest of moments, Carlos thought he recognized it. It was the same face, the same distorted, grotesque face that had been on the pizza. His stomach lurched as the figure took another step toward him, its hollow eyes fixed on him, its mouth stretching into a twisted grin. "Carlos," it whispered again, but this time, the voice was clearer, sharper. "You belong to me." His heart stopped. The figure began to move toward him, its steps slow, deliberate, as if it knew Carlos had nowhere to run. The darkness seemed to swallow up the light, closing in on him. The figure was getting closer, its grin widening, its presence more suffocating with every step. Carlos turned to run, but his legs felt like lead. He couldn't move. He couldn't breathe. The figure's voice echoed in his mind, drowning out everything else. You can't escape. The world around him began to blur, and he stumbled backward, his hands reaching out to steady himself. The pavement felt soft under his feet, like it was giving way, like he was sinking into the ground. And then, everything went black. Carlos awoke with a start, his body jerking upright as he gasped for breath. The darkness was thick around him, but this time there was no cold air, no shadowy figure, no distant whispers. Idrisil couldn't focus. Her brain was too completely tangled. He was back inside his apartment. For a moment he thought it was all just a nightmare, a terrible, twisted dream. He looked around, his eyes adjusting to the dim light filtering through the window. The same worn-out furniture, the same peeling wallpaper, the same familiar silence. But something felt off. Something was wrong. His phone, which he had dropped earlier, lay beside him on the couch. He reached for it, his hands still trembling, and unlocked the screen. No missed calls, no messages, nothing. He stared at the blank screen for a long moment before a sudden realization hit him. The pizza box. The one he had left on the counter. The one he had opened and found the horrifying face inside. It was still there, untouched, waiting for him. Carlos stood up slowly, his legs unsteady, as if he hadn't quite shaken off the nightmare. He moved toward the kitchen, the dread returning with every step. The pizza box sat on the counter, exactly where he had left it, but now the lid was slightly ajar, as though it had been disturbed. He reached for it, his fingers brushing the cardboard, and opened it. There was no face this time, no grotesque, contorted image staring up at him. Instead, there was just one slice of pizza, a single perfect slice. It was almost as if it were waiting for him, as if it had always been meant for him. Carlos felt a strange compulsion to take it. His stomach growled, reminding him of his hunger. The tension in the air was palpable, and for a moment he wondered if he was being drawn into something far darker than he could comprehend. But then he remembered the figure, the whispers, the haunting presence. He couldn't escape it. Not entirely. He reached for the slice. The moment his fingers touched the cheese, a cold shiver ran down his spine. The room seemed to warp, the walls stretching and shifting as if they were alive. The lights flickered, casting strange shadows on the walls, and in the reflection of the kitchen window, he saw it. The figure. The one with the hollow eyes, the twisted grin. It was standing right behind him. Carlos froze. The figure didn't move. It just stared at him, its grin widening with every passing second. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. All he could do was stare back, unable to look away from those dark, empty eyes. And then, the voice. You took the last slice. The words echoed in his mind, reverberating through his skull. He dropped the pizza slice, but it wasn't enough. It wasn't enough to stop it. The figure reached out, its hands stretching toward him, its fingers like sharp claws. Carlos backed away, but the figure kept coming, its smile now a grotesque, unnatural thing. You belong to me, it whispered. And then everything went black again. The end.